Hello there, and I want to go ahead and welcome you back to my channel. So we're going to go ahead and dive into Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, released 2 years after the release of Godzilla vs. Biollante in 1989. So here's a special thing about the 90s Godzilla movies. Yes, the same era of the Heisei era, but Toho was locking and loading, because a Godzilla movie every year, leading up to the final movie in 1995, which would go ahead and end the Heisei era. This right here is the movie that I feel like really set the tone from what we're going to know all the way to the end of this era. Because of the underwhelming numbers that Godzilla vs. Biollante achieved, lots of blame was placed on the unmarketable kaiju, Biollante. This is the reason that they kind of blame it and say this reason was a low draw. I personally think this is maybe just part of the reason, because honestly, when I look at the 80s, when I see King Kong Lives and Godzilla vs. Biollante, I just think it was a hard time for kaiju movies. I mean, it just seems like the interest in the audience and their attention just was not there for these films overall. So I don't think it's solely just because of the fact that it's Biollante. I mean, Godzilla's name is enough to draw the way it is. Another thing is I also feel like they waited too long to release another Godzilla movie after Return of Godzilla. I feel like there was that window of 2 to 3 years after that movie came out that they really should have struck. So, ultimately before Toho decided to bring the iconic King Ghidorah back in this movie, originally this was conceived as a planned rematch for Godzilla and Kong. This would have certainly been a guaranteed moneymaker. Imagine this. A Heisei era Godzilla vs. King Kong, released in 1991. Part of me kind of wonders, how would this hypothetical movie have played out? All we know is that Kong would have fallen in love with the scientist and turned into a cyborg. The issue was that Turner Entertainment demanded way too much. Basically, it was just legal mumbo jumbo. Yep, because Mommy Universal Pictures and Daddy Turner Entertainment were too busy fighting over custody of Kong. Alas, ultimately though, the idea would be lost, and it would be about 30 more years before we'd actually see Godzilla and Kong cross paths. With this idea dead in the water now, the idea was to go ahead and go through Toho's roster of many kaiju from the history of their movies and get the most iconic one, which was King Ghidorah. But they'd keep a certain element from the Godzilla vs. King Kong storyline. That I'll touch on more in a moment. But along the way, there'll be some major tweaks. The storyline opens up with the mysterious UFO sighting, Godzilla and UFOs, an age-old tale. Or is it really just from space, actually? Remember, the term UFO, while commonly associated with aliens, only means that it's unidentified. In this case, this isn't an actual alien race because it is a race from the future, the 23rd century that is. So we've got humans from the 23rd century, their mission to warn Japan about the danger that they're facing. Their story is apparently Japan no longer existed in the 23rd century due to nuclear pollution and Godzilla has destroyed the country. The source? Trust me, bro. While this storyline is developing, there's another storyline in this movie because allegedly there was a dinosaur that was sighted during World War II on an island. So basically we had American and Japanese troops that were doing war and battling it out, and then suddenly a Godzilla shows up and it defends the Japanese from the soldiers in their time of need. But the debate here is though, was this dinosaur actually defending them, or was it just defending its territory they were on? The overall belief is this is Godzilla before the Castle Bravo testing by the United States, before he'd become the Godzilla that we know today. All of these overall stories collide when Japan decides to trust the people of the future because, again, source, trust me bro, and go back in time and find the Godzillasaurus and remove him from Lagos Island and place him somewhere else so he doesn't mutate into the Godzilla that we know. Allow me to go ahead and pause this movie and kind of talk about what we have in this movie overall. Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah already feels off the wall compared to the last few movies. I mean, just the idea of time travel being incorporated in is something that it feels like those movies never even kind of processed or thought about. But this movie also, I feel like just the way it's shot and the overall tone also doesn't feel quite as dark as the last few movies. I mean, it has those more serious elements, but it feels like it's just dialing them back quite a bit. So it feels like it's completely different. In this movie, I like to say it's the movie that kind of changes the tone and the pace of the Heisei era from what we're going to see from here all the way to the end of the Heisei era. It's also interesting to see that King Ghidorah's origin story is drastically changed. Rather than being an alien from space that is bent on destroying the planet controlled by aliens, he is now a creature from the future, known as a Dorat, which becomes a major problem when it's left behind on Lagos Island, exposed to the hydrogen bomb test, and becomes a major threat in 1991. It's just a little bit of a change, but here's the deal. At the end of the day, it has a different starting point, and it leads to the same ending that we know and love. King Ghidorah being controlled by another race, trashing Japan, so the tradition continues. So if you're guessing that Japan has been double-crossed again by a race that promised to help them again, then guess what? Yep, you are correct. Bad track record, really. Truth is, all of their story that they told them was false. Japan was on track to becoming one of the strongest nations in the world. They chose to go back in time to 1991 because in the future, nuclear weapons are banned. This is the only way to go back in time and create King Ghidorah and control him. Alright, so the movie began and we had a Godzilla problem still after the events of Godzilla vs. Biollante. But now Godzilla has been removed from the timeline, or so we think. But now we have a King Ghidorah problem. But we need Godzilla to bail us out. What we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and use and expose him to modern nuclear weapons that will make him even larger and more powerful than before. I like this angle in this movie. It reminds the viewer, and it takes it on a different turn than Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, or Godzilla vs. Monsters era, where Godzilla was simply one of the heroes we needed. He was just a hero. But this movie, though, is presenting him as an anti-hero, though. He's bigger, he's stronger, he's more of a threat than he was even before than we saw him 2 years ago. So there's still a lot of danger, even though Godzilla is helping us out and fighting for us this time around. Just because he wins the battle doesn't mean he's going to be our hero from here on out, though. If Godzilla vs. Biolante's battle sequences did nothing for you, then guess what? I think Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah might do something for you. This movie, I feel like, has a good balance between realism and just wild off-the-wall battle sequences. I mean, we have King Ghidorah literally hopping on Godzilla, something that we would have never seen in Godzilla vs. Biollante. They were two different kind of kaiju battles, but this time around, it feels like we're getting those subtle little hints and throwbacks and winks towards the Showa era. And I feel like you gotta go ahead and have a little bit of that trademark Godzilla battle sequences in there, where you're seeing just off-the-wall things that you would not see real animals do, because that's part of the heart and soul of the Showa era and what made it so lovable in the first place. I like to compare it to, say, WWE games. Modern WWE games look great. Graphically, they look amazing. It's on par with what you see on TV, as far as presentation, that is. But in terms of gameplay, though, it really isn't as fun as what it was 20 years ago with a game, say, like Here Comes the Pain. You want to escape reality a little bit. You want to do some off-the-wall stuff. Godzilla movies, that's what you want to do. You want to see Godzilla and another kaiju do battle in a way that you would never see two Komodo dragons do battle or two bears do battle in real life. That's part of the draw here. So in a sense, really, it delivers where Godzilla vs. Biollante just missed the mark at that one point. And this isn't the only battle sequence, because once Godzilla rips off King Ghidorah's head, we enter the next phase of this film. No more King Ghidorah, but we have a Godzilla problem again. At this point, this movie feels like a 2-in-1 deal, because everything we introduced and all the elements from the beginning of the film just aren't really relevant anymore. The people of the future are killed, King Ghidorah is no longer a threat or at large, it switches the focus to Godzilla. And yes, we have another brilliant destruction sequence at night of Godzilla rampage in the city. Maybe it's not as stunning as what we saw in Godzilla vs. Biollante, but there's still some fun here. And if I'm honest, it's the daytime destruction sequences that look the best. Watching Godzilla enter the heart of the city, everything feels so organic and believable, the camera angles and all, but this all leads up to the reintroduction of King Ghidorah, now introduced as Mecha King Ghidorah. Mecha King Ghidorah's introduction is one of the greatest payoffs of this movie. It really makes it feel worth it if you're watching this deep into the movie, because seeing this new iteration for the first time is just really wild, but in a good way though. And let's not forget, this idea was taken and adapted from Godzilla vs. King Kong, the original idea where they had King Kong becoming a cyborg, or probably would have became Mecha Kong. But ultimately, I've talked about that enough though earlier in this video though. I think the idea of this works much better and is more organic for King Ghidorah. In the grand scheme of it all, this movie plays out and wraps up perfectly with some great intense, well done kaiju battling. I also got to say that I love that they had the epic finale in the city, which hadn't took place in the city in the Heisei era at this point. Even if I rate this movie lesser than the Godzilla vs. Biollante, there is still a lot of fun here. Does the story feel like a lot of ideas from US Hollywood films? Yes, technically it does. I mean, with the popularity of Back to the Future bringing in time travel, Terminator involving someone being sent back in time to intervene and save the world from an impending dark future? When I look at this time frame of movies, it feels like time travel storylines were just surging. Whether it was good like Back to the Future, or just flat out bad like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3. Yikes. But the good thing about Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is it just doesn't copy and paste ideas. It tweaks things to a country being tricked. Kind of a nice wink and throwback to Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, if I'm being honest. If you felt neglected with battle sequences in Godzilla vs. Biollante, this movie will tide you over. Despite lots of dialogue, it hits all the perfect spots that the Godzilla series was looking for after the rocky start in the early 80s. This movie was also the center of some controversy for its time, due to the battle sequence between the Japanese and the US. Personally, I never felt bothered by this. This was never an issue for me when I watched this movie. I still love the angle of it, and I've never really met any fans that really bring it up and say that's a big problem. I was just so blown away with the sequence and having so much fun with this movie, viewing it. And honestly, one thing I gotta throw in is I gotta love that wink towards Spielberg.
You can tell your son about it when he's born. Major Spielberg?
If I were to wrap this up, I'd like to say this movie feels like a blueprint for the TriStar Godzilla era in the 90s. And it would propel the Godzilla series forward in the box office, which is the plus side for this. A year later, TriStar would announce their intentions for a US released Godzilla movie that would spend the next 7 years in developmental hell. Maybe not my favorite Godzilla movie in the Heisei era, but guess what? Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah? A landmark Godzilla movie in the Heisei era. That definitely is a shifting point. And if you were happy to see King Ghidorah again, because get ready, because another classic kaiju is returning. Because next, we have Godzilla vs. Mothra, The Battle for Earth. Review coming up next week.